A photo developed in the darkroom, one that revealed more than just an image. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Let's hear from you. Tell me where you're watching this from. I truly enjoy reading every message you send. Here we go. The rose beds at Havisham Hall had never looked finer. Pink Queen Elizabeths bloomed in gentle contrast against the yellow climbers that wound along the trellised archways, and the lawns, cut precisely to half an inch, shimmered with dew despite the noon sun. It was Lady Harriet's annual garden fête, and nearly every resident of St. Aldhelm's had turned out for the occasion. The air was thick with the scent of scones, lilacs, and the faintest whiff of rivalry, subtle and sugar-coated in polite conversation, but present all the same. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a light grey summer frock with a modest hat trimmed in forget-me-nots, stood quietly near the lemonade table, sipping slowly. She watched the crowd, not as one who mingled, but as one who observed. Near the rose hedge, the ever-effervescent Daphne Blair fluttered about with a basket of homemade jam, her voice louder than necessary. Young George Lytton, the ambitious, new curate, nervously checked his watch every few minutes. At the far end, under a white parasol, sat Mr. Julian Pike, the guest of honour. He was a visiting photographer of considerable local reputation, invited by Lady Harriet herself to capture portraits of the event's more notable guests, as she had phrased it. Julian Pike was in his mid-30s, trim, with prematurely greying temples that gave him an air of distinction. He had arrived in St. Aldhelm's only 3 months prior, leasing a modest cottage on the edge of the village and converting the conservatory into a studio. He was charming, perhaps too charming, and terribly private. Yet today he was animated, positioning people, adjusting his tripod, catching the light just so. The townsfolk loved the attention, they loved being seen. The first tremor came not from a scream, but from a hush. A sharp intake of breath spread like a chill through the crowd. Miss Marple turned slightly, glass still in hand, as Daphne's basket of jam dropped with a muted thud to the grass. The silence rippled outward until all eyes were drawn toward the west garden path. There, beneath the stone urn where Lady Harriet had planted pansies in the shape of the Queen's initials, lay the body of Julian Pike, sprawled unnaturally, face turned downward, his camera still slung around his neck, the lens cracked like a spider's web. Lady Harriet let out a single, horrified gasp before swooning into the arms of Dr. Wendell, who had thankfully been only a few paces away, discussing begonias. A murmur rose, loud and disorganized, like the fluttering of too many wings in a cage. George Lytton crossed himself before stepping back, while Mrs. Hargreaves, the butcher's wife, immediately began speculating aloud, something about foreigners and poison. Miss Marple set down her untouched lemonade and walked slowly toward the scene, not in alarm, but with a curious serenity. Julian Pike's body had not been there moments ago. She had watched him photograph Lady Harriet only 20 minutes prior, and no one, not a single soul, had seen him fall. The position of the body seemed too deliberate. His spectacles lay beside him, folded and intact. His hands, limp but clean, showed no sign of a struggle. But his shadow on the paving stones had an odd slant, as though the sun and time had disagreed. Inspector Cray arrived within the hour, called in from Gillingham. He was a thick-set man with a thin temper, already unimpressed by the idea of questioning a garden full of gossipers. "Accidental fall," he muttered at first glance, though even he seemed unsure. There were no visible wounds, but there was a stillness about the body that unnerved him. He cordoned off the area with some rope borrowed from the marquee tent and began questioning the guests in a haphazard order. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood quietly on the fringes. She overheard Daphne insist she'd seen Julian arguing with someone behind the tea tables. Mrs. Lytton declared she'd seen him head toward the privet hedge, alone. Lady Harriet, upon recovery, claimed she'd told Julian not to photograph her left side and insisted it was most certainly not her fault if the man had died of distress. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes moved steadily from person to person. The camera strap intrigued her, so tightly slung it must have been adjusted recently. And the cracked lens, how very curious that such damage had occurred when the rest of the camera remained unmarred. But it was the film she thought of most, the photographs inside captured just before the fall. They might show more than poses and smiles. They might show shadows. As the fate dissolved into whispers and consternation, Miss Marple retreated to the sidelines once more. She asked no questions. She made no statements, but her eyes, keen and blue, had already begun their quiet tally. This was no accident. And somewhere amid the laughter that had turned to silence, someone had committed murder. Murder in daylight, beneath bunting and roses, while the whole village watched without seeing a thing. The news of Julian Pike's death spread through St. Aldhelm's with the ferocity of a sudden storm. By evening, the lanes buzzed with speculation, and every sitting room from the vicarage to the bakery's flat above was alive with candle-lit conversations. The villagers, whose lives normally revolved around flower shows and jam contests, found themselves at the centre of a mystery, and in St. Aldhelm's, where people prided themselves on knowing everyone's business, nothing provoked more excitement or unease than not knowing something. At the heart of this growing cloud of intrigue sat Miss Marple in her modest thatched cottage on Church Lane, knitting with practised ease while her mind looped around the puzzle of Mr. Pike's demise. She had spent most of the afternoon quietly observing the garden parties disbanding. It hadn't escaped her notice that young George Lytton left rather quickly, nor that Daphne Blair had seemed nearly hysterical, far more than the incident seemed to warrant. And as for Lady Harriet, she'd seemed genuinely shaken, yet oddly preoccupied with ensuring the police knew exactly when and where Pike had taken her photograph. Back at the village, the pub, the King's Fox, was doing better business than usual. Inside, amid the clink of pint glasses and the soft sputter of the fireplace, the villagers pieced together their own version of the day's events. Everyone had something to say. "It's those London types," muttered Albert Trenham, the postmaster, wiping his moustache with the back of his sleeve. "Come down here with their secrets and their gadgets. Never trust a man with a camera. That fancy. I heard he was in trouble up north," said Elsie Dawkins, the florist. "Had to move here quick. A scandal, they said. Maybe someone followed him." "Or maybe," interjected Daphne Blair, who had arrived at the pub uninvited but found a corner booth with her gin and tonic. "Maybe it was someone local, someone with a reason to keep him quiet." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several gave. Heads turned, but no one challenged her. Daphne leaned forward with the satisfied air of someone about to perform a monologue. You see, Julian wasn't just taking portraits. He was, how shall I put it, nosy. Took photos of all sorts, even when people thought he wasn't looking. Gardeners, back doors, the woods near the old chapel. Said he liked light and shadow. But what if he caught something he shouldn't have? Across the street at the vicarage, George Lytton sat at his desk, scribbling down sermon notes, but finding his concentration threadbare. He had spoken briefly to the police, confirming that he had last seen Julian around midday. He hadn't mentioned their earlier conversation, that Julian had asked oddly specific questions about the vicarage, garden, and about the history of a disused bench beneath the old yew tree. George had laughed it off at the time, but now it felt sinister. And if anyone asked again, he wasn't quite sure whether he would stick to the same version of events. Meanwhile, Lady Harriet had retired to her drawing-room, head resting on a lace-trimmed cushion, eyes glazed in thought. Her maid, Clara, hovered nearby with a cold compress, but Lady Harriet waved her away. She was tired, yes, but also furious. Julian Pike had promised to deliver her portrait in a sealed envelope by week's end, a personal arrangement, and now the man had the audacity to die before fulfilling his obligation. Worse still, the camera had not yet been recovered from police custody, and who knew what dreadful expressions might be immortalized on that film. She had always suspected Julian of being untrustworthy in a charming, dangerous sort of way. Down by the baker's, Mrs. Hargreaves had already pinned the blame on the foreign delivery boy who worked odd hours and never spoke a word of English. She told the grocer's wife that she had seen the boy lurking near the garden hedge during the fete, though no one else could confirm this. She insisted she had a feeling about him. But then again, Mrs. Hargreaves had similar feelings about nearly everyone under 40. Back on Church Lane, Miss Marple watered her geraniums before the evening chill set in, her eyes lingering not on the soil, but on the horizon. She had just returned from a short walk through the village, using her customary friendliness to gather bits of information. The postmaster was fond of exaggeration, Daphne relished drama, and the vicar was too nervous by half. What puzzled her most was the photographer himself, a solitary man, yet unusually adept at making people comfortable. And it was odd, quite odd, that no one could recall seeing him fall or hearing a cry or even noticing the precise moment when he disappeared from the gathering. She remembered something else as well, the photos. Julian Pike had taken at least a dozen portraits that afternoon. He had used an older film camera, not digital, which meant the images were locked inside those rolls, undeveloped, waiting in the small black satchel he always kept near his tripod. If the police hadn't seized it yet, it might still be at the hall. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early and wrote a polite note to Inspector Cray, offering her assistance, should it be desired, in collecting witness statements from the more reluctant villagers. She delivered it by hand to the constable's office before breakfast. The young officer at the desk looked at her blankly, unsure whether to laugh or salute. By mid-afternoon, Cray arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Begrudgingly. His expression suggested he didn't quite know whether to thank her or accuse her of meddling, but something in Miss Marple's tone had pricked at his better judgment. She didn't offer guesses, she offered patterns, observations about Julian's popularity, with the ladies, his interest in old buildings, the curious quiet of his death. Cray frowned. There's no sign of foul play yet. Could have been a stroke. Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea. Or it could have been something quite different. Forgive me, Inspector, but I have found that people, when hiding something, tend to tidy around the truth rather than sweep it away entirely. It's the crumbs they leave behind that matter. Cray raised a brow. And what crumbs have you found, Miss Marple? Oh, none yet, she replied with a mild smile. But I imagine they'll start to appear once people feel the dust has settled. You see, murder, if that's what this is rarely committed in haste. Even when the act itself appears sudden, the motive usually has roots. And as dusk fell once more over the village of St. Aldhelms, the townsfolk, though quiet, were restless. They speculated in hushed tones and watched one another with newfound suspicion. Julian Pike had captured shadows in his work, sharp-edged, frozen, unblinking. But perhaps one of those shadows had captured something too. And in that garden of roses and secrets, someone now feared what the light might still reveal. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap and waited. Not for a confession, not yet, but for the moment when someone, somewhere, slipped up just enough to leave behind a telltale trace, a gesture too careful, a memory too convenient, or perhaps a shadow that didn't quite belong. The morning after Julian Pike's death, St. Aldhelm's woke with a peculiar stillness, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Church bells rang as they always did, children walked to school with satchels swinging, and Mr. Tilly opened the greengrocer precisely at 8. Yet behind the usual rhythms there was a cautious edge to every smile, a slight pause in every greeting. The normal fabric of village life had frayed just enough for everyone to feel it. Miss Marple, after finishing her toast and marmalade, stepped outside into the weak spring sun and made her way toward the high street. She moved slowly, not from age but from habit. People talked more when they thought she was merely passing through. Her knitting bag hung at her elbow, the needles sticking up like antennae, but her mind was not on pearl stitches. It was on timelines, gestures, and a missing camera bag. Inspector Cray had confirmed that the film from Pike's camera was in evidence, though the bag containing the rest of his equipment had gone missing. Could have been stolen, he'd said flatly. More likely some curious villager made off with it before the cordon was up. Miss Marple had nodded sympathetically but privately disagreed. The garden had still been crowded when the body was discovered. It would have been difficult, nearly impossible, for someone to make off with the bag without being seen, unless the person had known precisely when to act and where the camera had been placed. At the post office, she exchanged pleasantries with Mr. Trenham, who seemed subdued today. He offered no new gossip, only a remark that the air felt heavy. Down the lane, she spotted young George Lytton crossing the road near the vicarage. He walked briskly, almost guiltily, glancing over his shoulder more than once. Miss Marple made note of it, not in judgment, merely as part of the pattern. Her path took her next to the hall. She'd not expected to be let in, but Lady Harriet, despite a headache she claimed was monstrous, agreed to see her. The drawing-room looked untouched from the day before, save for the tray of untouched biscuits and the tea that had grown cold. Lady Harriet herself reclined on a velvet chaise, a shawl over her knees, and an expression of injured dignity. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude," Miss Marple began gently, "but I do worry whether you've had any further distress, following yesterday's dreadful incident." Lady Harriet gave a theatrical sigh. "It's all been too much, Miss Marple. Simply too much. And to think I'd invited the man here out of charity. He had no connections, no roots in the village at all." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "And yet it seems he had begun to find quite a few subjects of interest." Lady Harriet opened her eyes slightly. "You mean Daphne and that little gardener girl? Well, men like him always attract that sort." Miss Marple didn't press. Instead, she asked about the photographs Julian had taken during the garden party. Were there any arrangements about who would receive them? Had Julian given her any indication of what would be delivered? Lady Harriet hesitated. "Only that he would send me the proofs privately. He was very professional, you understand. Very discreet." "Of course," Miss Marple said, though one wonders if someone else may have been less pleased by his discretion. She left the hall with a curious sense of disquiet. Not because Lady Harriet was lying, Miss Marple had expected that, but because of the way she lied. The pauses were too strategic, the reactions too timed. It was performance, but a rehearsed one. It wasn't guilt, exactly, but there was something she was guarding fiercely, perhaps something in the photographs. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, ostensibly to borrow a hymn book. George Lytton welcomed her with a pale smile, eyes a little too bright. He offered tea, which she declined, and they sat in the small study that smelled faintly of beeswax and old sermons. "You must be under strain," she said gently, glancing at the crumpled sermon notes on the desk. "It can't be easy for a young man newly arrived to see such trouble in his parish," George exhaled, the strain evident. I don't understand how it could have happened. He was perfectly well an hour before. No one saw anything." "It's as though he simply stopped." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Had you spoken to him much before the party?" George hesitated just slightly. "Not really. He asked me some odd questions a few days ago about the history of the churchyard, old graves, architecture. I assumed it was artistic curiosity." "Quite," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet you seemed tense yesterday when the police arrived." He gave a weak smile. "I don't handle death well." Miss Marple nodded politely, and the subject drifted toward the preparations for Sunday's service. She took her hymn book and left, not looking back, though she sensed George watched her all the way down the path. That evening, as twilight set, Miss Marple sat by her window and reviewed what little she knew. Julian Pike had been quietly inquisitive, interested in old things, old trees, old benches, old stories. He had charmed half the village and unsettled the other half. His death had come without struggle or noise, no wound, no one saw it happen. And yet he had died with a cracked camera lens and missing equipment. And someone in the village was lying, several someones in fact, but none so foolish as to do it badly. She recalled a curious thing Daphne Blair had said at the fete, that Julian had been lurking by the woods near the old chapel. The word had seemed charged. Miss Marple had passed that chapel many times, an abandoned place, closed since before the war. What might he have found there? The following morning she took a longer route on her morning walk, circling past the chapel ruins. They sat in a small clearing, wild ivy choking the stone walls and nettles creeping along the outer path. A broken iron gate leaned awkwardly, half off its hinges. Miss Marple paused near a weathered bench and studied the ground. There were faint indentations in the grass, recent ones. A patch of mud disturbed, a cigarette butt not yet faded by rain. Julian Pike had indeed been here, and he had not been alone. A rustling made her turn sharply. From the far side of the ruins emerged a small figure, Clara, Lady Harriet's maid. She froze on seeing Miss Marple, her hands gripping a trowel and a small cloth bag. "Miss Marple," she stammered, I didn't expect anyone." "Gardening?" Miss Marple asked sweetly. Clara flushed. "It's just, Lady. Harriet asked me to plant some primrose seeds near the chapel path. She thought it would brighten the space." Miss Marple gave a warm smile. "How thoughtful. Though I must say, most people would wait for permission before planting on church property." Clara's eyes darted left, then down. "I suppose. I didn't think anyone would mind." Miss Marple said nothing more, but as Clara scurried off, the trowel forgotten in the grass, she walked slowly to where the girl had been crouching. The soil was freshly turned, and from beneath a loose stone, Miss Marple retrieved a small leather strap, torn clean through. She held it delicately in her fingers. Not gardening refuse, not something lost by a villager on a stroll. A strap, perhaps part of a camera bag. Miss Marple did not disturb the rest of the soil. Not yet. But she tucked the strap into her pocket and resumed her walk, already hearing the soft clicking of mental gears. Somewhere between the ruined chapel, the cracked lens, and Clara's flustered gardening errand, the pieces were beginning to show their edges. The picture was still incomplete, but the frame was forming. By the next afternoon, Inspector Cray's list of suspects had narrowed not through method, but from the village's own enthusiastic rumour mill. The more colourful the theory, the more quickly it travelled, and soon only a handful of names were being whispered in the bakery, the hairdressers, and at the edge of every church pew. Daphne Blair, the fluttery gossip with too much interest in Julian's personal affairs. Clara, Lady Harriet's maid, caught near the chapel with suspicious tools. And young George Lytton, whose nervous demeanour had only deepened since the fete. The inspector, being a man who preferred simplicity over subtlety, found this list reassuring. "So far as I'm concerned," Cray announced during a conversation with Miss Marple outside the constable's office, "we've got three possibilities. One emotional, one opportunistic, and one just plain odd. Could be jealousy, blackmail, or maybe even a tussle over stolen photographs. Either way, we're close." Miss Marple, who was inspecting a bruised apple from the grocer's next door, smiled faintly. "Yes, Inspector, though it often pays to remember appearances deceive." "Especially in villages where everyone plays their parts so very well," Craig grunted, unconvinced. He had already spoken with Clara again that morning, having heard from a passing schoolboy that she'd been seen near the chapel. She claimed she had simply gone for a walk, feeling airless after serving tea all day. But the inspector had pressed. He asked about Pike's bag, the one still missing. She'd looked genuinely puzzled, too puzzled perhaps, and denied ever seeing it. "And what about Miss Blair?" Cray asked. "She's a lively girl," Miss Marple said mildly, "but not nearly as foolish as she pretends, the sort who feigns helplessness when it suits her. Still, I doubt she's capable of murder, not unless it was a crime of passion." Cray raised an eyebrow. "You think she was in love with Pike?" Miss Marple gave a thoughtful pause. "I think she was in love with being seen. Mr. Pike made her feel important, photographed her like she mattered. If he stopped doing that, she might have taken it personally." Cray huffed. "Then maybe she did take it personally with a push." But Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "He was found on level ground, Inspector. No edge to stumble from, no bruising consistent with a fall. Besides, the position of his body, it lacked chaos. It looked staged. Someone wanted him to appear, to have collapsed peacefully. That is rarely the case in a spontaneous death." That same evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Daphne Blair's cottage. The door was open, and music drifted faintly through the air, an old jazz tune playing from a scratchy record player. Daphne, wearing a silk robe and red slippers, was painting her toenails in the parlour. She looked up with theatrical surprise. "Miss Marple, what a delight! Come to ask about Julian, I suppose. Everyone has." Miss Marple sat, knitting already, in hand. "Only if you feel like talking, dear. It's such a nasty business. I imagine you must be terribly upset." Daphne sighed deeply. "Oh, it's all so tragic. One moment he's taking pictures, the next he's face down in a flower bed. I suppose that's what comes of having no roots, no one to look after you." "Did you know him well?" Miss Marple asked casually. "I suppose," Daphne said, twirling the brush in the bottle. "He was kind to me, made me feel seen. You—" "No, he said I had a face for shadows. Can you imagine? Said it like it was a compliment." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he ever take any private portraits of you?" Daphne's eyes flashed. uncertain whether to be flattered or insulted. "Maybe a few. Nothing improper. I'm not a fool, Miss Marple. I wouldn't give a man like that any leverage." "Leverage?" Miss Marple echoed softly. Daphne shrugged. "Oh, come now, you must have heard the whispers. Julian was no saint. He had a way of learning things. People trusted him, and he listened too well. I think he liked knowing secrets, maybe even keeping a few." After tea, Miss Marple walked home by the long road, letting Daphne's words settle. She had not lied exactly, but she had deflected, and that was its own form of dishonesty. Leverage was a curious word, too calculating to be casual. It suggested Julian Pike knew things he wasn't meant to. And if he'd used what he knew as insurance, then someone may have taken measures to erase the debt before it was called in. Back at the vicarage, George Lytton had received a visitor. Not the police this time, but Lady Harriet's butler, delivering a note. It was a brief message. Lady Harriet wished to speak to him in confidence the next morning. George placed the letter on his writing desk and stared at it, pale and sweaty. He had buried something in the vicarage garden the night before, something small but incriminating. He had lied to the inspector about the timeline, just slightly, but that lie had grown heavier with each hour. And then there was Clara. That night she cleaned Lady Harriet's study as usual, humming to herself while dusting around the figurines and leather-bound books. She paused once, staring at the envelope, marked "To be delivered by hand, Julian Pike." It had been hidden beneath a stack of newspapers on the writing desk. Her hand reached for it, hesitated, then withdrew. She didn't know what was inside, but she feared that Lady Harriet did. The next morning, Clara did not report to work, nor was she seen at her lodgings above the stables. By midday, word spread that her room was empty, her belongings still in place, but the bed undisturbed. The only thing missing was a grey travelling coat. Inspector Cray took this as confirmation. "There's your suspect," he declared to Miss Marple. "Runs away. The moment things heat up, we'll put out notice with the neighbouring villages." But Miss Marple remained still. "Yes, fleeing looks suspicious, but what if she didn't run? What if she was removed?" Cray looked sceptical. "You think someone got to her?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Julian Pike took pictures that unsettled someone powerful, and now that someone is removing the people who might know too much." She didn't add that Clara had been frightened, terribly so. Her hands had trembled when Miss Marple confronted her at the chapel, not like a guilty person, like someone being watched. Miss Marple returned home, sat in her chair, and resumed her knitting with even rhythm. A strap in the dirt, a girl with secrets, a photograph not yet developed, and now a disappearance that was far too tidy. The threads of the puzzle were tightening, each one pulling closer to something heavy, hidden beneath the surface of St. Aldhelm's quiet charm. She felt it pressing inward, the sense that the village was being gently strangled by its own polite silences. She would not speak too soon. She never did. But she had begun to see the outline of the truth, if not yet the whole shape. And she knew this. Someone in St. Aldhelm's was not content with one death, and the next mistake they made might be their last. The morning after Clara's disappearance, the village of St. Aldhelm's awoke in subdued agitation. The cobblestone paths echoed with restrained footsteps, and even the birdsong seemed slightly muted. At the post office, the usual clatter of gossip had given way to soft murmurs and wary glances. 2 incidents in 1 week, a sudden death and a vanishing, was enough to unsettle even the most stoic villagers. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. Beneath her composed exterior, her mind worked with the steadiness of a pendulum, collecting scraps of truth from moments others deemed too minor to matter. Clara's disappearance, though troubling, wasn't the only thread Miss Marple had begun tugging. After her brief visit to Daphne Blair's cottage and her observation at the chapel, she'd begun to feel that something crucial had been hidden in plain sight. She just didn't yet know what. By mid-morning, a knock at Miss Marple's door brought Inspector Cray back to her sitting room, his expression tense. "We found something," he said without ceremony, placing a clear evidence envelope on her table. Inside was a black and white photograph, creased, slightly smudged, but intact. Julian Pike had taken it the week before the garden fete. The image showed the west garden of Havisham Hall. A stone path ran through the middle, flanked by hedges and rose bushes. But it wasn't the path or flowers that caught the eye. It was the shadow. A tall, dark figure stood just beyond the arch, the face obscured by blur or motion. The light had caught them in an odd pose, half-turned, hand lifted, as if they'd just spotted the photographer. "We pulled this from one of Pike's undeveloped rolls," Cray said, folding his arms. "It's not from the day of the fete, earlier. Probably taken while he was scouting angles. But who is this? We can't make it out." Miss Marple stared at the photo longer than Cray expected. Then she leaned back and folded her hands in her lap. "Do you recall what Clara said she was doing the day before the party?" "Polishing the silver," Cray replied. "And fetching roses from the kitchen garden." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "Lady Harriet told me that Clara was forbidden to pick any flowers before guests arrived." "The garden must be untouched," she said. "So if Clara was in the kitchen garden, she was disobeying." "And I don't believe Clara ever disobeyed." Cray frowned. "So," Miss Marple tapped the photograph lightly, "that figure, look at the hemline. A coat, yes, but not a maid's coat, more tailored. And the hand, look closer at the fingers." Cray narrowed his eyes. "Gloved?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "No gloves, long fingers, polished nails. That's not Clara, Inspector. That's Lady Harriet," Cray scoffed. "You think she crept into the garden to spy on Pike?" "I think she was worried about something he'd captured on film. And I believe she may have confronted him once already, before the party." Cray exhaled. "You've got good instincts, Miss Marple, but instincts won't get us a confession." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but perhaps the rest of the photographs will." Later that day, while Cray returned to the station, Miss Marple made her way, quietly and with purpose, back to Julian Pike's rented cottage. It remained sealed, the door padlocked by the local constable, but Miss Marple had already gained special permission to assist the investigation, and the key had been entrusted to her under Cray's reluctant supervision. She opened the door and stepped into the small front room. The cottage smelled faintly of photographic chemicals and stale tobacco. On a side table lay a half-developed roll of negatives, and beside it a ledger. Miss Marple ignored the camera equipment and instead opened the ledger, scanning the neat, looping script of Pike's hand. There were names, dozens of them. Notes about lighting preferences, poses, and delivery dates. But one name had been circled. Twice. Mrs. Dorothea Minton, a shadow request, urgent. Dorothea Minton was one of the quieter residents of St. Aldhelms. A widow of nearly 10 years, she lived alone in a small white cottage near the churchyard. Miss Marple knew her only in passing, polite nods at services, the occasional conversation about dahlias. She was not a woman one expected to appear in anyone's urgent notes. Miss Marple closed the ledger and left the cottage, pausing only to double-check the lock. Then she walked slowly to Dorothea's. The door opened after a second knock. Dorothea appeared, eyes wide, behind small glasses, hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised. "Is something wrong?" "No, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I was wondering whether I might ask you something about Julian Pike." Dorothea hesitated, then stepped aside. Her sitting room was meticulously neat, not a cushion out of place. She offered tea, which Miss Marple declined. "You had your photograph taken by Mr. Pike, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Pause. "Yes," Dorothea said slowly. "He approached me, said he'd seen me near the graveyard and liked the light." "And you asked him to take a shadow picture," Miss Marple said. "Something discreet?" Dorothea flinched. It was subtle, but there. "Miss Marple, I never told anyone." "You didn't need to," Miss Marple said softly. "Mr. Pike made a note. He also mentioned it was urgent. Might I ask why?" Dorothea exhaled shakily. "I didn't want anyone to know I'd asked for it. It wasn't vanity. It was a matter of protection." Miss Marple waited, offering no judgment. "I'd asked him to photograph someone else," Dorothea said. "Someone I believed had been watching me. A man. Tall, kept appearing outside my home at odd hours. He never knocked, never spoke. Just stood there. I thought I was imagining it at first. But Mr. Pike offered to help. He set up his camera near the garden gate, said he could catch the man in the act using shadows and time exposures." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "And did he succeed?" Dorothea swallowed. "He said he did, but he never showed me the picture." Miss Marple nodded. "May I ask, did this man ever confront you directly?" "No," Dorothea said quickly. "But he wasn't just a stranger. I think it was someone from the village." Miss Marple left with a warm handshake, her mind now swirling with intersections. If Pike had caught a stalker on film, someone living among them, and if that image revealed their identity, then there was now a very clear reason why Pike might have been silenced, and perhaps why Clara had vanished. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sorted through the photograph Cray had shown her, the ledger notes, and the torn strap she had found by the chapel. She realized that all the events, Pike's death, Clara's disappearance, Dorothea's request, tied not to impulse but to fear. Julian Pike had been a collector of images, yes, but more dangerously, a collector of secrets. That evening, she returned to the chapel one last time. The wild vines stirred faintly in the breeze, and the soil near the broken stone was still fresh. She crouched slowly and lifted another stone, revealing a half-buried roll of film in a wax paper pouch. It had been hidden quickly, perhaps by Clara, perhaps even by Pike himself in a moment of panic. But now it was found. Miss Marple wrapped the roll carefully and placed it in her handbag. Then she rose, the chill air wrapping around her shoulders. She didn't need to develop the film herself. She would bring it to Inspector Cray in the morning. But she already knew. Someone in that village had been caught in shadow. And the truth, when it came, would expose far more than just a murderer. By the following morning, the unease in St. Aldhelm's had become nearly tangible. People moved, with the caution of those unsure who might be watching. The baker's smile was thinner, the butcher's laugh more forced. Gossip now came in whispers and half-sentences, and at the heart of it all was the photo that no one had seen, but everyone believed existed. The one that Julian Pike had taken, the one that someone, somewhere, was willing to kill, to suppress. Miss Marple arrived at the police station precisely at 10 o'clock. She placed the wax paper-wrapped roll of film on Inspector Cray's desk without ceremony. Cray, still bleary-eyed from a night of chasing leads that went nowhere, looked at it as if it might bite him. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Under the stone bench near the chapel," Miss Marple replied softly. "It was buried, hidden in haste, I imagine." Cray muttered something and called for an officer to deliver it to the photography lab in Gillingham. "We'll know soon enough if it shows anything useful." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I suspect it will show everything useful. But you may not recognize it immediately. The truth, I find, is rarely loud. It whispers." Later that day, Miss Marple paid another visit, this time not to observe, but to speak plainly. She walked through the gravel path to Havisham Hall, and requested a private word with Lady Harriet. The butler, though stiff, admitted her. Lady Harriet was in the morning room, seated with a newspaper, its pages untouched. She looked up, surprised but not unprepared. "Miss Marple, how kind of you. I had rather hoped you'd come by. I assume you've heard that Clara has run off?" "I have," Miss Marple said, taking the seat opposite, "although I wonder if run off is quite the right phrase." Harriet's eyes narrowed. "You think she was taken?" "I think Clara saw something she shouldn't have, and someone panicked." Harriet's voice sharpened. "Surely you're not suggesting I had anything to do with—" "I'm not suggesting, Lady Harriet," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm wondering about your conversation with Julian Pike 3 days before the fete, about the envelope he left in your study, about the photograph in which your shadow appears quite prominently, and about your maid who was loyal to you right up until she wasn't." Lady Harriet's composure faltered. A flicker of fear, or was it calculation, passed behind her eyes. "I was photographed without my consent," she said, voice low. "That man had no right to snoop into my affairs." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "But I suspect he captured more than you intended, and you knew it. That's why you went to him. That's why you insisted on receiving the negatives privately. You wanted to control the narrative before it spiraled." Lady Harriet's lips curled into a tight smile. "There's nothing criminal about protecting one's privacy, Miss Marple, particularly from men who prey on gossip." "No," Miss Marple said, "but there may be something criminal in silencing those who won't be silent. Clara perhaps threatened to go to the police, or to Miss Blair, which is nearly the same thing in this village." Harriet leaned forward, tone suddenly cold. "You have a vivid imagination, Miss Marple, but no evidence. You said yourself that truth whispers, and whispers, I believe, are easy to deny." Miss Marple did not respond. She stood, gave a faint bow of her head, and left the hall. But she had seen it, just beneath the veneer of noble outrage, not guilt, not yet, but fear. Lady Harriet was afraid of something being discovered, not necessarily because she had committed the crime, but because she had helped cover it up. And cover-ups were always messier than the crime itself. By late afternoon, the village received its next jolt. Clara had been found. Not dead, as many feared, but frightened and bruised, hiding in a disused shepherd's hut on the edge of Cotter's Wood. A farmer's dog had sniffed her out. She had no bag, no shoes, and no voice when the constable brought her in. Inspector Cray sat with her for an hour before she managed to speak. Miss Marple waited outside, knitting slowly until Cray emerged. "She says she didn't run away," he told her. "Says someone cornered her in the hall's wine cellar the evening after Pike's death. Told her to disappear or she'd end up like him. Doesn't know who, it was too dark. She managed to slip out through the scullery entrance and ran straight to the woods." "Poor child," Miss Marple murmured. "She's lucky they didn't mean to kill her. At least not yet." Cray looked troubled. "That changes things. It means someone with access to the hall is involved. A servant? Harriet herself? Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "I don't think Lady Harriet is the killer, no, but I believe she knows who is." That evening, Miss Marple received a note slipped under her door. No signature. No date. Just a simple message in shaky handwriting. "You're right. He saw something. It's in the photograph. The one with the clock tower. Ask Daphne about the watch." Miss Marple read it 3 times before folding it into her apron. The clock tower. There had been no mention of one in the official records or village chatter. But Pike had taken dozens of photographs, and at least one had been near the edge of the churchyard. The watch? That pointed to something else, an inconsistency, a lie wrapped in a story. The next morning, she found Daphne Blair in her garden, pruning dead blooms from her rose bushes with the delicacy of someone unused to the task. Daphne looked up with a mixture of wariness and charm. "Miss Marple?" "Come, for more village scandal?" "I'd like to ask about Julian Pike," Miss Marple said, cutting to the point. "And about a watch." Daphne stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "He photographed you by the church gate, didn't he? Just before the fete?" Daphne hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He said the light was right. I was flattered. And he asked you to hold something, a pocket watch, perhaps." Daphne's hand drifted to her neck. "It was his. Said it would give the photo a timeless feel." "But it wasn't his," Miss Marple said softly. "It belonged to someone else." "Someone you recognized?" Daphne looked away. "I didn't think it mattered. It was just a photo, just a moment. I didn't think he'd die." Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Was it George Lytton's watch?" Daphne blinked rapidly. "I don't know. It looked like his, but I never asked. He's always so careful with it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Exactly. He wears it constantly. So if it wasn't on him that day, but it appeared in the photograph, someone else had it. Or someone staged the photo to include a clue." Daphne swallowed. "Why would Julian do that?" "Because he knew he wouldn't live to tell us," Miss Marple said. And in that moment, the faint shape of the murderer came closer into view, not yet distinct, but no longer invisible. A misplaced watch, a buried photograph, a shadow beneath a clock tower. Each piece was falling into place, guided not by chance, but by human weakness, vanity, fear, pride. Miss Marple did not rush, she never did, but she now knew whom she must watch next. Rain fell steadily over St. Aldhelm's the next day, blurring windows and muffling footsteps, yet it could not wash away the tension that now gripped the village. Miss Marple, seated by the parlour window of her cottage, watched as villagers hurried by under umbrellas, their heads bowed not only against the weather, but against the weight of suspicion now festering among them. What had once been mere whispers had grown into silences, tense, calculating, and expectant. The photograph from the chapel had returned from Gillingham that morning. Inspector Cray sent a young constable to deliver a copy to Miss Marple. She placed her knitting aside and studied the image under the lamplight. It was a long exposure, as she had suspected. The light caught the edges of the crumbled stone and wild ivy, but the true subject of the frame was what stood just to the left of the chapel arch, a tall figure, head turned, partly in profile. There, unmistakably, was George Lytton. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. She had suspected him of being entangled, but this complicated things. George had said he rarely visited the chapel, yet here he was, caught on film in the same place where Julian had been seen wandering, the same spot where Clara buried the torn strap. His expression wasn't startled or accidental. He had looked directly at the camera. That implied he had seen Pike and said nothing. Miss Marple wasted no time. She put on her coat and walked to the vicarage, the rain soaking her hem by the time she reached the doorstep. George answered, pale and tired, as though he hadn't slept. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "To what do I owe? You've lied," she said gently but firmly, stepping inside without waiting. "You told the inspector you hadn't seen Julian Pike in the days before his death." "But the camera says otherwise." George's face drained of colour. It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "I didn't think it mattered. I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't believe you did, but you're protecting someone." George sat heavily in his armchair, hands trembling. "He asked me questions," he whispered, "about the chapel, the graves, the woods. Then he said he needed a favour, a small thing. He wanted to borrow my pocket watch, just for a photograph." Miss Marple nodded. "So he had it, and you let him take it?" "I thought it was odd," George said, "but he was persistent. He said it was important, symbolic even. I only realized later that he wasn't borrowing the watch for art. He was sending a message." "A message meant to survive him?" Miss Marple said softly. "Do you know who it was for?" George hesitated, then looked away. I think he knew someone was watching him, and he knew the person would recognize the watch, understand its presence in the photograph as a warning. But I don't." "Know who?" Miss Marple left soon after, the watch now heavy in her thoughts. Julian had taken a deliberate risk, not just with images but with implication. Someone had seen that watch, perhaps even before the film was developed, and understood. It was meant to incriminate, and if George hadn't killed him, someone else had. Someone who feared what that photograph might say. As she walked through the muddy lanes, she passed by the bakery, where two women stood huddled under the awning. Miss Marple paused as she heard one of them mention Clara. "They say she's not." "Well," one whispered, trembling like a leaf. "Won't speak to anyone but Miss Marple and the doctor." "They say she saw something," the other replied. "Something she shouldn't." Miss Marple made a note to visit Clara before the day's end, but first she turned down a side lane toward the home of Mrs. Dorothea Minton. The widow had not been seen since news of Clara's return. That absence was peculiar, especially from a woman who had admitted Pike was trying to catch a stalker on her behalf. Dorothea answered the door in silence, her face drawn. She stepped aside, letting Miss Marple in with a nod. "You saw the photograph, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Dorothea didn't reply. "It's George in the chapel," Miss Marple continued. "But he wasn't the man who frightened." "You, was he?" Dorothea sat slowly, hands clasped. "No, it wasn't George. It was someone else. Someone who came in the evenings. Tall, wore a heavy coat. He always stood in shadow. I thought it was Julian once. But after what happened, I knew it wasn't. Do you think Julian caught him on film?" Dorothea looked up, and for the first time fear crept into her voice. "He said he had proof that the photograph he took of me by the church gate captured a reflection in the glass behind me. A face." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "And did he name the face?" Dorothea hesitated. "He didn't say. But the day before he died, he left me a note. I didn't understand it then, just 2 words. Not Harriet." Miss Marple stared. So it hadn't been Lady Harriet. That confirmed what she had suspected. The true culprit had used Harriet as a convenient shield, benefiting from her pride, her insistence on privacy. But it also raised a new question. If Julian had tried to clear Harriet's name, who was the person framing her? She left Dorothea's home deep in thought. The pieces were converging, but something still sat just out of reach, a single layer unpeeled. Back at the constable's office, she stopped to speak with the officer who had first responded to the scene of Pike's death. A young man, polite, if a bit unsure. She asked a simple question. "Where was the camera bag found?" The officer blinked. "It wasn't." Miss Marple blinked. "What do you mean?" "Never turned up," he said. "The body had the camera around his neck, yes, but the rest of the equipment, tripod, bag, spools, gone. We assumed someone stole it before the cordon was up." But Miss Marple's eyes had gone still. No theft was ever that clean. The camera had been left on the body to create the illusion of completeness. Whoever staged the scene had taken the rest, intentionally, then made sure Julian looked like a man who collapsed mid-work. Someone in the village possessed that bag. And whoever it was, they had been one step ahead the entire time. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and sat in silence for a long while. She thought of Clara's panic, George's guilt, Dorothea's hidden note, the reflection in the glass. And finally, she remembered something Daphne had said that no one else had. He said I had a face for shadows. Why would Julian say that? Because he saw something reflected in her eyes, or because she had been in the background of a photo not meant for her? Miss Marple stood abruptly. She crossed to her old writing desk and pulled from the drawer a folded piece of paper. The photograph Cray had shared earlier, the one showing the chapel. In the top right corner, near the blurred hedge, there was a sliver of movement. Barely visible, but on closer inspection it was unmistakable, a gloved hand reaching toward something. Or someone. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The real killer had never planned to kill Julian Pike. They had planned to scare him, silence him. But Julian, clever to the end, had photographed his own demise, one frame at a time. By the next morning the rain had lifted, but the village of St. Aldhelms remained as grey and heavy as the clouds that lingered on the horizon. The latest whispers about a gloved hand captured in a photograph, about George Lytton's borrowed watch, about Clara's terrified disappearance, had grown quieter, not from lack of interest, but from the slow realization that someone among them had done more than simply lie. They had murdered. Miss Marple rose early and prepared a pot of tea, her movements precise and unhurried. The photograph lay on her table, half covered by a folded handkerchief. She had stared at it late into the night. That faint blur near the chapel hedge, it wasn't just a gloved hand, it was a gesture, a reach, an act caught mid-motion. The question was not whether someone had approached Julian Pike. It was whether that someone had meant to kill. She tucked the photograph into her handbag, then fetched her umbrella and headed for the police station. Inspector Cray was already there, slumped at his desk, thumbing through notes. He looked up as she entered and offered her a tight nod. "I don't suppose you've come to clear everything up for me?" he muttered. "Not quite," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I may have a way forward." Cray raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "I believe the person responsible for Julian Pike's death is someone who feared exposure, not just from what he saw, but from what he might reveal. Someone who assumed Julian's photographs could unearth a secret they had buried long ago. I propose, Inspector, that we set the final stage, a gathering, one that will allow me to observe something important." Cray scowled. You want to throw a
party?
I want to recreate the garden fete with the same people, the same setting, and one additional element, Julian's photographs, arranged for viewing. Officially, we'll say it's a village tribute. Privately, we'll be watching for a reaction. Craig grunted. You think someone will panic? I think someone already has, Miss Marple said quietly. And this time we'll be watching. Later that afternoon, invitations were discreetly sent around the village, explaining that Lady Harriet, with the cooperation of the constable, and Miss Marple had agreed to host a small memorial tea for Mr. Julian Pike. Though it was a modest affair, nearly every resident of note agreed to attend. Curiosity, guilt, and fear proved more powerful than any reluctance. The event was held on the same lawn where Julian's body had been found, though the spot itself had been tastefully cordoned off with rose planters. Folding tables displayed, framed portraits from Pike's recovered work, photographs taken over the previous weeks, children smiling, old couples seated on benches, a local seamstress pinning bunting to a fence, and in the centre the photograph that had sparked the most unease, the chapel scene, enlarged and mounted with care. Miss Marple stood quietly near the photograph, sipping tea. She wasn't watching the picture. She was watching the watchers. Lady Harriet stood near the refreshment table, head high, but her eyes scanned every guest with veiled concern. George Lytton lingered near the punch bowl, clearly ill at ease. Daphne Blair flitted between groups, asking far too many questions in a voice too shrill to sound natural. Mrs. Dorothea Minton arrived late, her expression unreadable, and positioned herself near the back. And then there was Mr. Edward Stratton, the village solicitor, normally unremarkable, always perfectly dressed and just detached enough from the gossip circle to avoid being seen as part of it. He was the last to arrive, and Miss Marple watched him carefully. As Stratton moved past the photograph of the chapel, something flickered across his face. Not surprise, he had expected to see it. Not fear, he had steeled himself against that. It was something else. Calculation. The same flicker Miss Marple had seen once in a courtroom in Exeter, just before a man gave a false alibi with perfect diction and a steady voice. She approached him with the ease of someone making polite conversation. Mr. Stratton, I was just admiring this particular frame. It's so subtle, isn't it? The way the light falls near the chapel hedge. Quite a talent Mr. Pike had. Stratton offered a stiff smile. Yes, though it seems an odd choice for a memorial display. Oh, but it was one of his favourites, Miss Marple said. He said it showed something hidden, something most people missed. Stratton's eyes flicked to the photograph again. A tree stump, I'd guess, or perhaps the odd shadow of the archway. Miss Marple smiled. Or perhaps someone in the process of doing something they shouldn't. Stratton's teacup shook slightly as he brought it to his lips. I'm sure if that were the case the police would have acted already, he said smoothly. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. Or perhaps they needed one final moment, a test, if you like. She turned from him and walked toward Inspector Cray, nodding once. Cray moved immediately, not with dramatic flourish, but with quiet purpose. He approached Stratton and asked him to come for a brief word. The solicitor followed, but his movements were slower now, less certain. Minutes later, inside the hall's morning room, Cray laid out the evidence on a side table. The photograph, the strap from the missing camera bag found buried near the chapel, Clara's statement about the cellar, the recovered film with George's watch in the shot, but no George visible, suggesting a staged scene. And finally, the original chapel photo with the gloved hand reaching toward the camera. We don't have your face, Cray said, arms crossed. But we have enough to show that Julian Pike was lured there, possibly drugged, and arranged to look as though he collapsed naturally. You were the only person who knew which evidence to remove and how to do it quickly. Stratton said nothing. Miss Marple, seated nearby, added gently, You were never in the frame, Mr. Stratton. But Julian was clever. He knew someone would come for him. And he knew you couldn't resist cleaning up after yourself. Stratton's jaw clenched. He was going to destroy me. Those pictures, he had one of me from 5 years ago with a woman who wasn't my wife. He threatened to expose it unless I helped him access village records. Said it was research for his art.
You refused, Miss Marple said softly. So he turned it into leverage. Stratton's voice broke. He wasn't supposed to die. I just wanted the negatives, that's all. I followed him to the chapel to confront him. He laughed, said,
He'd already made copies. I grabbed the camera bag, tried to rip it from him. He fell, hit his head. Wasn't even a hard fall, but he didn't get up. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. So you staged it? Left the camera, took the rest, hid the bag, hid Clara. Stratton nodded once. She came downstairs while I was in the cellar. I panicked, told her Julian had fallen, and if she said anything, she'd be blamed. I never meant for her to run. I thought she'd stay quiet. Cray said nothing for a long moment. Then he signalled the constable waiting outside the door. Miss Marple remained seated, fingers gently folded in her lap. Another secret unearthed. Another truth revealed, not through force or shouting, but through patient watching, a delicate pull at a loose thread until the whole fabric came undone. As Stratton was led away, she glanced again at the photograph. The gloved hand, the chapel arch, the overgrown hedge. Julian Pike had captured it all, not just with light, but with foresight. He had known how to speak even in silence. The news of Edward Stratton's quiet arrest spread through St. Aldhelm with eerie efficiency. By mid-morning, every household knew that the village solicitor had been escorted from Havisham Hall in full view of the tea guests, his head down, his mouth shut. Yet in classic village fashion, the truth took on different forms depending on the teller. Some insisted he had confessed to 3 other crimes. Others whispered of blackmail involving foreign spies. Only Miss Marple and Inspector Cray knew the exact details, and neither indulged the rumours. Still, even as the shock settled, something lingered, a disquiet, an itch of incompleteness. Stratton had confessed, yes, but only partially. He had claimed Julian Pike's death was an accident, a fall. Panic had driven his next moves, not malice. But Miss Marple had seen too many tidy endings to believe in them. Stratton was hiding something, not everything perhaps, but something vital, and until that last piece fit, the picture remained incomplete. She paid a quiet visit to Clara, who was recovering under the care of a kindly widow near the village edge. Clara was pale, thinner than before, but no longer trembling. She smiled faintly at Miss Marple and offered a seat by the window. "I heard," she said softly, folding her hands in her lap. "Mr. Stratton, he's the one, isn't he?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, he was involved, certainly. But I'm not convinced he acted alone, or at least not entirely without pressure." Clara looked down. "There's more, isn't there?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I believe there is. I was hoping you might help me find it." Clara hesitated. "There's something I haven't told anyone. I didn't think it mattered. But the day before the fête, I was cleaning the back corridor near Lady Harriet's study. I heard voices. Mr. Stratton was speaking with someone, another man. I couldn't see who. But they were arguing, something about needing more time. One of them said, If he publishes that photo, it's both of us finished. And then I heard Mr. Stratton say, "We'll take care of it quietly, like we did in Bath." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her pulse quickened. "Bath?" Clara nodded. I didn't know what they meant, but it sounded like something had
Happened before, something bad.
Miss Marple thanked her and left soon after, her mind now turning swiftly. The phrase, "like we did in Bath," was more than suggestive, it was confirmation. Stratton hadn't acted alone, not in this, and perhaps not in the past either. Someone else had been involved in silencing Julian Pike. Someone still in St. Aldhelm's. And if Stratton had named no one, it was either from fear or loyalty. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the police station, where Inspector Cray was going, overstatements with fatigue drawn into every line of his face. She placed her handbag on the desk and sat down across from him. "I believe there is another man," she said simply. Cray groaned. "Miss Marple," Stratton confessed, "we've got motive means—" "Partial motive," she corrected. Stratton said Julian Pike threatened him with a photograph. But why now? Why, after 3 months in the village, did Pike suddenly pressure him? And why did Stratton mention Bath to someone who hasn't been identified? Cray blinked, then reached for a notebook. "You're saying there was an earlier incident?" "I'm saying Julian Pike may have discovered something that predated his arrival in St. Aldhelm's, something involving both Stratton and another man." "Bath is the key," Cray rubbed his forehead. "I'll ask regional records." "No need," Miss Marple said calmly. "I already have a suspect. I just need to be certain. And to be certain, I'll need one final meeting." The next morning, Miss Marple invited George Lytton to tea. He arrived precisely on time, looking more at ease than he had in weeks. Miss Marple served him sponge cake and tea, chatted briefly about Sunday's sermon, then placed a folder on the table. Inside were 2 photographs, the first Julian Pike's chapel shot, with George Lytton's image standing clearly by the arch. The second, a cropped frame from a different roll, one Miss Marple had only just discovered among Pike's effects. It showed a group of men standing on the steps of a civic building, a press photo perhaps. Among them stood Edward Stratton, and, beside him, unmistakably, George Lytton. George's hand froze around his teacup. "You were in Bath," Miss Marple said gently. "You and Stratton both. A legal conference, I believe. But there was a scandal afterward, a clerk accused of misconduct."
The story was buried. George looked pale.
"You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You and Stratton were involved in something you wanted forgotten. Julian Pike found out. Perhaps he recognized you from Bath, or perhaps he was tipped off. Either way, he learned your secret. And then he photographed it." George stood, his voice trembling. "I didn't kill him. I never meant for it to happen like that." "No," Miss Marple said. "You let Stratton do the dirty work. He always had the stomach for it. But you were there. You guided Pike to the chapel. You knew he liked natural light, ruins, hidden corners. You set the stage." George's eyes filled with tears. "He said he wouldn't show it to anyone. But then I saw him talking to Clara, and Daphne, and Dorothea. I panicked. I told Stratton. I thought he'd talk Pike down, maybe buy the negatives."
"I never thought—" Miss Marple nodded. "But you saw the aftermath. You helped cover it. You told the police you hadn't seen Julian in days. You lied to protect yourself." George sat back down, suddenly deflated. "What will happen now?"
Marple stood. "That depends on Inspector Cray, but I'd suggest telling him everything, honestly this time. Stratton has already admitted enough to send him away, but the village deserves the whole truth. Later that afternoon, Inspector Cray took George Lytton into custody, not with drama, not with shouting, but with quiet resolution. The second man had been found. The final layer had been peeled back. The next Sunday, St. Aldhelm's Church was fuller than usual. The villagers came not for gossip, but for closure. Miss Marple sat quietly in the back pew, hands folded. Lady Harriet attended, her posture stiff, but her expression softened. Clara sat beside the kindly widow who had taken
her in.
Daphne, for once, remained silent. As the sermon ended and the congregation drifted into the soft spring light, Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer. She thought of Julian Pike, how he had come to the village as a stranger and left it, changed, not by violence alone, but by the truth he refused to bury. Truth, Miss Marple thought, had a strange way of surfacing, even in the quietest places. Spring deepened in St. Aldhelm's, the lilacs began to bloom in full, the days stretched longer, and the murmur of scandal, once sharp as thorns, faded into the background hum of everyday life. It was the village's way after all. Tragedies passed like storms, the gardens were weeded, the paths swept clean. But under the tidy hedgerows, something always lingered, a tension never quite voiced, a memory half acknowledged. Miss Marple sat in her garden with a cup of tea and a plate of oat biscuits untouched beside her. The newspaper beside her chair bore the bold headline, "Stratton and Lytton sentenced, 2 found guilty in Pike death." The article, carefully worded, avoided the more sordid details. It focused on legal technicalities, mentioned a tragic accident turned cover-up, and touched briefly on the misconduct case from Bath that had been officially reopened. The piece ended with a line praising the keen observational assistance
of a local resident, which Miss Marple, of course, found quite unnecessary. What mattered wasn't the attention.
What mattered was that the village could breathe again. Clara had returned to work, this time as assistant to Mrs. Dawkins at the florist, who had taken her in with a stiff-lipped generosity. Daphne had become quieter, perhaps even gentler. Lady Harriet, after a brief trip to Bournemouth to recover her nerves, had returned to her routines with a renewed interest in community events, perhaps hoping to rewrite the past with perfectly arranged garden parties. And yet beneath it all, Miss Marple knew that what had occurred would never quite vanish. Not for those involved, not for those who had watched, speculated, or stayed silent. St. Aldhelm's had been reminded, as all such villages eventually are, that even under the cleanest doilies and most polished teacups, shadows could grow. And sometimes those shadows could kill. She reflected on the curious role Julian Pike had played, a man not of the village, not known or trusted, yet one who had seen more in 3 months than many had in 30 years. It was not just his lens, it was his awareness. He had captured not just faces but intentions, and he had paid for it with his life. But he had also ensured, in his quiet and careful way, that the truth would outlive him. The photographs he left behind had not simply recorded a moment, they had forced a reckoning. A knock at her gate stirred her from thought. It was Inspector Cray, without his coat, his sleeves rolled slightly, and an expression that mixed fatigue with something like respect. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his head. "Inspector, tea?" He declined with a smile and instead took a seat on the garden bench, looking out over the hydrangeas. "It's done then," he said after a moment. "As done as it ever is," Miss Marple replied. "Justice is rarely tidy, but I dare say the right people are held accountable." Cray nodded. "Stratton's sentence was heavier, as expected, George Lytton, the court took leniency. Your testimony helped. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. He didn't
Kill.
but he let pride steer his actions. And fear. That's always the more dangerous of the two. Cray sat in silence for a while, then glanced toward the little birdhouse tucked under the ivy. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" Miss Marple smiled. "I get tired of being reminded why it's necessary." He chuckled at that. "You know, you caught something none of us did, not in forensics, not in records, not even in witness statements. You saw how people moved, what they didn't say, the way they flinched at photographs." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "It's
Or rather simple, really. People reveal themselves always, especially when they think they're unseen."
Cray stood and straightened his cuffs. "Well, I hope we don't need your assistance again any time soon. But if we do, I'll be here," she said, finishing the sentence for him. "Tending my roses and watching." After he left, she remained seated for a long time, eyes resting on the sky as the clouds drifted westward. A breeze stirred the hedges. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance. It was, in every visible way, a peaceful day. But she had learned long ago never to mistake stillness for peace. Stillness, she knew, often hid more than it revealed. Later that week, a small envelope arrived by post. It bore no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Julian Pike's final frame, one he had developed himself, printed and wrapped before his death, hidden among his things, and only now surfaced through police custody. It was not a portrait, not a staged moment. It was a simple image of the village square, early morning, no one present but a cat on the far corner, and the shadows of rooftops stretching long across the cobblestones. But in the lower left, just barely visible in the play of light and texture, was a shape that didn't belong. A silhouette. A man, tall, lean, hands in his pockets, standing still in a spot where he shouldn't have been. Not a ghost, not an intruder. Just someone out of place. Miss Marple turned the photograph over.
Nothing was written. Nothing needed to be. Pike had left it for someone like her. Someone who could see what others overlooked. She placed the photograph in her drawer beneath her neatly folded handkerchiefs. It was over, yes, but it never truly
ended. Murder, she had long believed, was not an event. It was a crack, a fracture in a place or a person. And the business of uncovering it was not to heal the crack, but to reveal it, to expose the weakness so that others might step carefully. St. Aldhelm's would forget in time. It would return to its fêtes and flower shows, its book clubs and choir rehearsals. But Miss Marple would not forget. She would remember the photographer who captured his shadow, and the shadow that revealed a killer. As the evening drew in, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. A new pattern, clean lines, no phrase, but just beneath her fingers, the thread looped, twisted, shaped, reminding her always that the smallest things, when followed carefully, could unravel the greatest lies.